We admire the beauty of a butterfly, but rarely do we admit the changes it has undergone to achieve such beauty. Maya Angelou. To me, the phrase speaks to the sum is only as good as its parts. And if I am the sum, then I am only as good as the parts, speaking specifically to the people who've poured into me. I like to call it granting grace. The people who have impacted my life did it in 4 specific ways: belief, wisdom, love, and light. To me, they poured into me with belief in terms of when I would give up, they would take the time to remind me that I have to continue going, that they believed in me, and that my future was just something I couldn't see yet. Wisdom, they would always share with me things that I needed to do to be better, to reach higher, to achieve my goals. Love, that was unconditional, even in terms of making mistakes. Because when I did, all they would remind me of is that mistakes are absolutely part of the journey to success. And light, when I couldn't see where it is I was going, they would remind me of my future. You see, it's essential for us to realize that education is reciprocal. Sometimes you're the teacher, and sometimes you're the student. And if we're wise enough to understand that, we teach that to children when they're young, that there are absolutely going to be times that I'm going to pour into you, and there are absolutely going to be times that you pour into me. I'm going to share with you several stories that helps illustrate my point. On my path, when I was young, I was in high school, and there was one particular teacher. Her name was Miss Cully. She was about 5'6", blonde hair, Caucasian woman, and she taught religion class. And I hated that class, but more importantly, at that time, I kind of hated school because I had to actually go to class and work hard. But that was fine because I knew that my mom had very high expectations, and so failure was never an option. So I would go to class quietly, marginalize myself, sit off to the side, do my work, and not say much. You see, the school I went to, I was one of 3 African-American students, and I wasn't wealthy or even near there. So as I went through my educational experience, I quickly understood what that meant for me in that context. And so instead of allowing others to marginalize me, I marginalized myself. And so one day after class, Ms. Cully pulled me aside and she said, "You know, I noticed that you're clearly a good student because you do all your assignments, but you don't speak in class. Instead, typically you'll write the assignment and you hand it in. I need you to understand that your writing is prolific. And so as you go through and continue to do this, you need to understand that that's a way you can express yourself." So for lack of time and better words, I was like, okay, great, yeah, I get it, I understand. And as any other teenager would do, I ran out the door and hoped she'd never bother me again. But she did. And so shortly thereafter, within the next couple of weeks, she took the time to pull me aside again to say, "I don't really know why you withdraw from class, but what I know for sure is that you're going somewhere. And so perhaps part of my job is to help you realize your potential if you can't see it." And so the funny thing as an adult now is I realize that teachers have this amazing gift where they actually can see how far we're going to go. But as a child, you don't always see it. So she said, "You know what? Instead of talking about it, I'm not going to ask you too many questions. What you need to do is write about it, because your writing is incredible. Write it, even if only to yourself. And when you write it, throw it away, give it away, speak it, do something, but allow that to help you gain your freedom." And so the short end of that is that it took me some time to realize that apparently I did have a gift for writing, and so I continued to write a lot through life. And when I would hit really difficult bumps in the road, that would be my moment to free myself from myself. And so that teacher inspired me to realize several things, but one most importantly, that I am the one who has the opportunity to free myself, but that she cared enough that despite why I did or did not engage in her class, she understood that I absolutely had purpose, and that part of her journey was just to tap me on the shoulder and remind me of that. My second experience that I want to share with you was my freshman year in college. I was a HEOP student, and so I didn't really understand why we had to go to this whole summer thing. Like, what is this summer academy? I don't want to go there. I want to be home hanging out. And so part of what we had to do was actually go and spend 6 weeks in a summer course. And so when I arrived, I went to class, and when I walked into a class, I looked at the teacher, and I knew many, many things, but two things for sure: that he was no joke, and that I was probably going to work harder than I'd ever worked in my life. And I didn't really know if I liked that too much, but I knew it wasn't an option. His name was Mr. Walker. He was about 6'2" or 6'3", African-American male, and the most significant thing about him to me in that moment was he was the first African-American teacher I had ever had in my experience. And his presence commanded respect. And it also, literally him standing in front of you reminded you that what he had to say was probably really important. And so by default, you knew who was in the room with you. So my experience that summer was interesting because I worked harder than I ever worked before. But I took away so many things from that experience because he took time to pull me aside, but even in class, he reminded us of our responsibility to ourselves. He not only showed me what it means for people to have real expectations for children and how high when you set that bar, that we will reach it. But he also taught me to learn to develop who I was. He reminded me of my obligation to myself as a woman and as an African-American woman. And I spent 6 weeks reading books by Nataki Shange and Asada Shakur and Angela Davis. And so from that experience, it made me push, and it inspired me to get a deeper understanding of who I was, who my people were. And it actually aligned to what my parents had taught me my whole life. But the greatest gift was understanding that I had the most responsibility to myself, that no teacher and no parent could provide me that. Those two teachers, among many others, inspired me to do many things as I grew. And one of the things that I realized was, if it was not me, then who? If those people didn't take time along my path to pour into me and to utilize those four things, teach me those four things through my life, where would I be? And so it inspired me to go to college and ultimately become a teacher. And so now I had this awesome responsibility, an obligation, if you will, to now pour into students. Because education, in that moment, I understood was actually reciprocal. And so now I felt this obligation to go do what they did for me, for others. And so there were two students that I will always remember. One who couldn't identify 13 letters of an alphabet, who was in 7th grade. And my gosh, I didn't know what to do. I knew I could work hard on his behalf. I knew I would learn to be able to figure out what to do to support him. And so I spent the next 2 years, because I looped with him on purpose, building and pouring and reminding him of his purpose, his power, and most importantly, his responsibility to himself. And so we usually don't know what happens as a result of that, because those teachers I just spoke about don't actually know what they did for me. So I ultimately became an assistant principal. I left. I went to a new school, and one day, the security called me and said, Miss Green, there's a student here to see you. She said, there's someone here to see you. I said, who is it? She said, it's your son. I said, that's impossible, because I knew my son wasn't downstairs. And so I went downstairs, and this was the student. And he said, Miss Green, I'm graduating, and I just need you to come to my graduation. And that was the moment I think I smiled from my socks, because I realized that that young man had to travel however far, figure out where I was, and come to me so that I could go be there and celebrate him. And so I went. And for anybody who's an educator, you understand that that feeling is amazing, because you pour and pour, and you drop all these pebbles, and you wonder. And for him to find me, I was humbled. And so I still speak to him today. And so that was that moment where I realized that they poured into me, and now I pour into him. And so we're going to fast forward to about 5 months ago. I used to be a principal at Valesgate. And one day I was at the school, and I'm walking around, and there was this little guy that when I was there, we spent many, many, many days together. Probably more than we should have, because he was always in my office. And in my head, I said, well, I wonder if I'm making a difference. I wonder, if anything, if he understands how much he matters to me, because that's what matters to them. And so that particular day, I'm walking in the halls, and all of a sudden I hear, "Miss Green." And I turn around, and this little guy beelines it down the hallway, and I bend down, and he launches into my arms, and I grab him, and I hug him so tight. And it was that moment, if you will, self-actualization. What I've come to do, I did. And it came back in the form of him reciprocating to me what genuine love really is. Not what we talk about, but what it really is, what it authentically is. You touch me, I touch them, and we continue to move forward, making the world a better place. And so I don't know where his journey ends, as I did with the other student, because he is only 6 years old. But I know that there are moments in his life when, as he gets older, that he will remember that moment probably just as much as I did. And I hope that he reaches back to tell me my impact on him. You see, we just have to be mindful as we educate people, specifically children, that they realize that we're not always the teacher because we're the adult. That there are absolutely moments where they're going to come and they're going to educate us. And it feels kind of strange when you switch. Anybody who's a parent understands how that feels. And so I'm going to share with you the last example that will emphasize that moment from the parent perspective. And so often you'll tell your children and you remind them of their responsibility, their obligation, what they have to do. You need to go to college, all these things. And to them, you think they hear, wah, wah, wah. But it was my last 4 months of my doctorate work, and I was working on a chapter. And if anybody has a doctorate degree, you'll understand what I'm going to say. But if you don't, I can liken it to a root canal, because it's that painful. And I had written probably 12 or 15 times the same chapter, and it felt like 300 or 400. And I got my edits back. I'm at the kitchen table. I see the edits. I slam the computer, and I affectionately call it an adult tantrum, which many of us have had in our moments, where you're over it, you're finished, and you literally want to be a child, but you can't be because people are watching, so you have to just get up politely, go in your room, and then have the tantrum. And my son walks into the room, and he says, "You seem kind of upset. I know you're doing a lot, and I know you're working really hard, and I get that you're probably frustrated, and I could see you're upset. Here's my thought. Take your moment, do what you got to do, but when you finish, just make sure you get up and go back to the table and finish your chapter. Because you've taught us we don't quit. If you need me, I'll be in my room." And he turns around and he leaves. And there's a bunch of things I wanted to respond. None of them were appropriate. So in that moment, I'm still in my tantrum. But I realized the most valuable thing, that was the shot heard around the world. That he was the teacher and I was the student. And that education is an ebb and flow. Sometimes we forget that the youngest around us tend to actually have the most wisdom because it's the most authentic. But in that moment, I realized that my sum is only as good as all of my parts, and all of those parts are a compilation of every person that has graced my path and bestowed a blessing. We admire the beauty of the butterfly, but so rarely do we understand the changes it has undergone to achieve such beauty. Thank you.